Thank you for coming. Today's speaker is Hanna Dietterich. Hanna arrived here at the beginning of January to work on lava inundation, both in Saudi Arabia and in locations within the U.S. Hanna's background is she was an undergraduate at Pomona, where she worked with Jade Star Lackey, studying metavolcanic rocks, so the Saddlebag Lake Roof Pendant. That's the one up by Tioga Pass that you all see when you drive through there. She graduated magna cum laude and was awarded an NSF graduate fellowship, which she took to the University of Oregon, where she worked with Kathy Cashman and various USGS staff members, mostly at HVO, studying various aspects of lava inundation. Somewhere along the line, she also collaborated with Sean Da Silva, studying the volatiles that were released in the Huayna Patina eruption in Peru. We're lucky to have her. She is multi-talented. Her first publication was actually on Douglas fir trees. Something about, do Douglas fir trees have juvenile wood in their needles or something like that. I don't know what it is. You all can look it up, or you can ask her about it. Her star is rising rapidly. As of, I believe, yesterday, she received an invitation from the Royal Society to go to Britain and give a lecture on her work on lava flow emplacement. So I'll hand it off to Hanna.
All right, thanks for that introduction, Tom. So I'm going to talk today about part of the work I did for my PhD on the influence of topographic interactions on lava flow morphology, particularly lava channel networks, and lava flow behavior. So this is work I did with my PhD advisor, Kathy Cashman, and then also Alison Rust at the University of Bristol. So I'm interested in studying lava flows because they're very common on the surface of the Earth, as well as all of the terrestrial planets. They're complex fluids. We don't really know everything about their physics. And they're also quite hazardous. So you can see on the left 3 eruptions from the past few months that have all had impacts on people. So we're interested in lava flows for all of these reasons. And in places where there are active lava flows, we're interested in monitoring volcanoes to look for new eruptions, but also in advance of eruptions and also during eruptions, being able to predict lava flows, being able to predict where they're going to go, for instance, producing these hazard maps for Hawaii and Mount Etna, and then also how fast and far they're going. So I was working at the Hawaiian Volcano Observatory this summer and went to a community meeting in the town of Pahoa, downslope of the currently active flow field, and these were the questions they wanted to know the answers to very much, and that are actually very hard to answer. The other thing they really wanted to know was what we could do about the lava flow, ways to mitigate lava flow hazards. So people have done various things in the past of bombing lava flows, spraying water on them to make them cool faster, and then building walls and diversion barriers to try and redirect flows away from infrastructure. For instance, this guy built a barrier in his backyard in Pahoa this past fall in hopes of stopping the flow from reaching his house. So we actually for these mitigation efforts, people haven't actually done a lot of work about how best to undertake these. No one's actually tried to figure out the best way to divert a flow really, or what the impacts of anything they might try to do are. And this is because we don't fully understand lava flow emplacement to be able to predict those impacts. But we do actually understand a lot of the controls on lava flow behavior. And this is a Hawaii-centric talk. I did my PhD work all in Hawaii. And we do know that there are 2 main morphologies of lava in Hawaii. The first on the left is pahoehoe lava. These are lavas that advance in sort of fits and starts through these breakouts of lobes. They form lava tubes that transport the lava long distances. And then lava, which is the rough, rubbly, thicker lava on the right, that's transported through open channels. So this talk is mostly going to focus on flows. but we even know what transitions, what causes these two different morphologies. And so you can get lava by increasing the strain rate on a lava flow, so it starts going faster over a higher slope, say, and also increasing the viscosity, so maybe it starts to cool and becomes stickier and starts to auto-brecciate like that. One of the controls on lava flows that we have also known for a long time is that effusion rate, or the volume of lava coming out of the vent per time, is a crucial factor in determining flow behavior. And particularly, George Walker, back in the 1970s, identified a relationship globally for many different volcanoes that effusion rate correlates positively with lava flow length. So his sort of trend is defined in the dashed lines. And on here, this is a plot from Jenny Riker's paper. She's plotted a bunch of Hawaiian lava flows onto this plot. And what you can see in Hawaii in particular is that over a wide range of effusion rates, the flows seem to be limited in length to about 25 kilometers. So we're interested maybe also in what factors limit lava flow length. We also see that effusion rate exerts a strong control on flow advance rate. So this is a plot from Jim Kwahikawa and others showing the distance on the x-axis and time on the y-axis. It's reversed from what you might expect. But plotting the advance of many different eruptions, different flows, with color-coded by their effusion rate. So these very low effusion rate, low flux flows take a very long time to go not very far, whereas the high flux flows can go very far very quickly. So the effusion rate is really important for how fast the flows are going to advance. Underlying slope also plays a big role. So if on a higher slope, the flow is actually going to go a lot faster, and it will also thin. And then cooling and crystallization play a big role in lava flow behavior. The lava flows erupt at the vent as often quite fluid, and then as they travel, will cool and crystallize and change dramatically. So on the left is a plot of distance from the vent on the x-axis and logarithmic viscosity on the y-axis for the Mauna Loa 1984 flow. And what we can see is over 25 kilometers of flow from the vent to the toe, the apparent viscosity increased by 6 orders of magnitude. So viscosity and cooling crystallization play a really big role. And the viscosity on the right, you can see that flow velocity decreases greatly as viscosity increases, and that flow thickness or height increases a lot as the viscosity increases. So these all play a role in behavior and morphology. And all of these things we know about, these controls on lava flow behavior, have been incorporated into predictive models. In Hawaii, there's really only been one numerical predictive model for flow emplacement, and that's FlowGo, made by Andy Harris and Scott Rowland. And what they do is make a channelized lava flow, start it at the vent, and say if it's going to cool, if it's going to go over a slope, how far is it going to get before it freezes or stops moving. And so this is somewhat simplistic, and it includes models of flow as a single channel. And what we see is that lava flows in Hawaii are a lot more complex than that. So this was sort of the topic that got me really interested in Hawaii, because this is not the way flows are modeled, but it's the way flows actually are in Hawaii. And so this is LiDAR data we collected in 2009 of the Mauna Loa 1984 flow. It's just the upper portion you can see in the box over here. There are 2 larger branches that extend to the full flow length. And what we can see is from the vents in the lower left and downslope, the flow is dominated by branching. It bifurcates a number of times and forms a distributary channel network, like a delta. And what we can see in observations of the eruption is that many of these channels were simultaneously active. There are other flows that have different channel network geometries. So this is LiDAR data from the same survey of the December 1974 lava flow at Kilauea. And it erupted from a series of fissures in the upper right, and then flowed down slope, but kept running into the fault scarps of the Kauai fault system. And so each time it did so, it forced all the channels to merge and form big confluences, flow along a fault scarp, and then as soon as the fault scarp ends, you can see in the Google Earth photo right here, the flow is able to branch a bunch again downslope, and then it all crashes into another fault scarp and gets sent completely sideways to the southwest. So this actually causes the flow to form a tributary network, a lot more like a river. So some of the questions that were motivating this research then are what controls the creation of the bifurcations or branch points and confluences or merge points, and then how do they affect the flow morphology and behavior? So what about them do we need to consider in terms of predicting flows? So we want to then first quantify the channel network geometry, identify potential controls on the channel network geometry, and then test the influence of networks on flow advance and morphology. So to quantify channel network geometry, we went into the fluvial geomorphology literature, and if you ask a fluvial geomorphologist to tell you how complex a braided river system is, they will tell you to draw a straight line across it and count how many channels across the braided river is. That's the simplistic term, the Braiding Index. We can apply that here to the Monoloa 1984 flow, to the channels that I've mapped out on the LiDAR. And what we can see is that there are regions of the flow that have more channels, indicated by the redder Braiding Index colors, or fewer channels. So there is variation. And we can also think not just on sort of the flow segment scale, but on the individual channel scale, and think about network topology, so the interconnectedness of the network. And we can again apply river metrics. We also looked into like neuroscience, brain connectivity metrics, and other things that people use to quantify networks. But for example, the river network, the Sri border, which is just a measure of how many vents or how many sources feed a given channel segment. So you can see on the right in the map of the Kilauea December 1974 flow of every channel or pathway coming from a vent. As they merge, they accumulate in Sri border. And so you can identify the sort of dominant channels through the system. And you can do the same thing for a distributary flow by counting how many flow toes are fed by a given channel segment. So this is just a piece of it's actually flow 4, the southernmost branch of the Monoloa 1984 flow, where you can see, again, the dominant channels that go on to feed the most flow toes. So in looking at the LiDAR data, we see that those big fault scarps, for instance, control a lot of the channel network geometry. We see places where the flow is splitting around cones. So we want to investigate whether networks can form through obstacle interaction, which requires looking at the pre-eruptive topography. So fortunately, before the 1984 flow, there was a 1977 aerial photograph survey of the area, which we can use to reconstruct the underlying surface through photogrammetry, as you can see in the lower right. And then comparing that to the 2009 LiDAR DEM, we can even calculate the thickness of the flow over the flow field. And so this allows us to pursue answers to the question of whether networks form through obstacle interaction by looking at the flow thickness relative to any sort of obstacle thickness or height. So in theory, we think that a flow that's thicker than an obstacle is tall will be able to overtop an obstacle and therefore keep going on its merry way. And that an obstacle that's taller than the flow thickness, if the flow is very thin, the flow won't be able to surmount the obstacle and it will be forced to split around it. So we want to check whether flow thickness seems to be a control on the channel network geometry. So we can look at things that might control the flow thickness as well. So here I've plotted a map of the braiding index, so you can see the colors of the cross-section lines in the channels, and that's on top of a map of the underlying slope. So high slopes are bluer, low slopes are greener, and what you can see by just sort of looking at the map is that areas that are bluer correspond to areas with more channels and redder cross-section lines. And you can see that just in the plots below, the increased slope correlates with higher braiding index, so a greater number of parallel channels in a section. And that higher slope also corresponds to lower flow thicknesses. So that at high slopes, the flow seems to be thinner, you're ending up with more parallel channels, which is consistent with this theory, that at low slope, you're going to have more overtopping and get fewer channels. And at high slopes, you're going to have less overtopping and more splitting and forming parallel channels. But there's also field evidence that other things may be at play here, that a simple thickness relationship isn't necessarily the whole story because the flows are dynamic. So one thing people observe in debris flows, and I think they sometimes observe in lava flows, is that you can get run-up due to the momentum of the flow onto an obstacle and maybe overtop it that way. You get fluid dynamics responses when you hit obstacles. And we see field evidence for this is a location where the flow splits. And you can see that the flow is greatly thickened right at that location. So we can document this, and then I will get to it later. But fluid dynamics may be playing a role as well. So then we can look at what the effects of the channel network are on the flow morphology. So the braiding index, the more channels we have across, we see that the flow is wider, which makes a lot of sense. But we actually see that over higher slopes, instead of the flow narrowing, which is if it was just a single channel, you would expect it to, the flow branches so much that it overcomes that and ends up wider as well. We can also look back to that measure of channel importance and look at the channel segment scale and say that at a higher Shreve order, which was that measure of importance, the channels are narrower, and that it also corresponds to how long they're active for. So channels that are most important, according to the Shreve order, are also the longest lived based on records of the eruption. And this is consistent with the observed channel evolution by Pete and Norm Banks, in that the channels that initially form upslope of the flow toes are very broad, and then as they continue to be active, they'll solidify inward and become narrower, and will also form more localized levees in a narrower channel. And so we can see this increased thickness as well, in that this is the full flow thickness map for this upper section of the flow where we have the LiDAR data. And within this zone, the area outlined in red is the longest lived. And it also contains the thickest portions of the flow. And we can compare that to the area, the bottom three flows here, were only active for the first 2 days of the eruption. So when looking at what controls channel networks and thicknesses, I was only looking at these lower three flows because there aren't breakouts and overflows and things like that, later overprintings of the channel network. And we can see if we just count up the volume held in these different sections of the flow, the longest lived portion has the highest volume for sure. But actually the first three flows, or flows 2 through 4, which were active for only the first 48 hours of the eruption, contain 40% of the volume within this upper section of the flow. So initially, a tremendous portion of the effusion rate at the vents was being directed to these side branches. So that's going to make a big difference if we go back to a relationship like this between the effusion rate and flow length, because the effective effusion rate of a flow might be related to how complex it is. And so if we look at flows that are confined, like the Kilauea December 1974 flow that was mostly against fault scarps, or I use the Mauna Loa 1859 flow that was caught in the sort of valley between Mauna Loa and Hualalai volcano. And we see that confined flows travel much further for a given effusion rate and duration than unconfined flows, which makes a lot of sense, but has implications for what you're going to predict during an eruption. And we can also look at that effect on advance rate. So if effusion rate controls the advance rate, if you branch the flow, we expect that then to have an impact on the advance rate. So a place where flow advance rate was very well documented is during the first episodes of the Pu'uo eruption, where folks seem to be out there all night There are measurements from like 3 in the morning of the flow front through time. And so we can look then at how fast the flow is going before and after splitting. So on the plot on the right, I'm plotting the advance rate before the flow splits against the advance rate after the flow splits. And all of those solid symbols are places situations where, in the absence of an increased slope as well, or another branch shutting off, they plot largely along a 1 to 2 line, where the advance rate after splitting is about half that of before splitting. So in summary, our observations from Hawaiian flows are that bifurcations and confluences can form from interaction with topographic obstacles. We can see it happen. And the overtopping is dependent on the flow thickness. We can measure that, but perhaps also some other factors, the dynamics of the flow. And that branching produces shorter, slower flows, and that confinement can produce longer and faster flows. So then we can go into the lab and test these experimentally. So the interaction of a viscous flow with an obstacle is not actually a well-understood phenomenon. There's a lot of work on looking at how a river hits a boulder and will respond to it. But people don't generally spend a lot of time, the mathematicians haven't spent a lot of time thinking about viscous flows. So we've got some mathematicians interested in this problem as well. So we do experiments with golden syrup to look at sort of the underlying physics of a viscous obstacle interaction. And then also experiments with molten basalt to look at an actual cooling fluid and say, how is it going to respond to an obstacle? So in these experiments, we can control just the flow, so we can control the effusion rate or flux. We can control the underlying slope. And then we can control the obstacle. So we look at different obstacle shapes, orientations of like linear oblique obstacles, and sizes. And so in both of these fluids, we're dealing with, in these experiments, we have Reynolds numbers less than 1. So we're looking at places where viscous forces dominate over inertial forces. So in the analog experiments, which are done at the University of Bristol in the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics lab, we have a piston-style pump that can extrude syrup. This is golden syrup. You'll see it in the baking aisles. It's not as common in the US. In the US, you would do these experiments with corn syrup. It's actually frequently used as an analog for lava and also magma for people looking at bubbles and all kinds of things. So it's a very well-understood fluid. And in this scenario, where we have a flux through a point source hole in an unconfined plane, or a flat plane where the flow is unconfined, is quite an well-understood scenario. There's fully developed theory for it. And so what we're adding is the obstacle. And to collect some data on this, as well as an overhead camera, we mount a caliper over the top of the experiment to measure the thickness of the flow, because that's one of the things we think we care about. And what we can see is that in the absence of an obstacle, the syrup experiments match the basic theory for an unconfined viscous flow really well. So the first thing we wanted to do was, coming from that LiDAR analysis of when flows might overtop an obstacle or not. So if we just take a constant obstacle of a constant thickness, that's on the order of the flow thickness, so that some of the flows will be thicker and some of them will be thinner than the obstacle height. We can vary the flux and slope to change the thickness and see when flows will split or overtop the obstacle. And we build a nice regime diagram here. And then we can compare that to the thickness of the flows. And what we see, the green line plots the flow thickness, or the height of the obstacle. And what we can see is that thickness, the contours are all thickness, does not seem to explain when the overtopping occurs, because lots of flows that are thicker than the flow height, or thicker than the obstacle height, can't overtop the obstacle. And this is because in syrup, there's a surface tension problem at the scale of the flow thickness relative to the thickness of the obstacle. So the overall thickness of the flow is actually surface tension. It's thick enough that surface tension is not important, but surface tension is important over the length scale of just how far over the top of the surface of the obstacle the flow has gotten. So we can't actually use these experiments to say anything about that. But what we can see is that if we plot velocity contours instead, we can see that all the flows, as velocity increases, the flows are able to overtop the obstacle. And this is because at high velocities, you form a bow wave upslope of the obstacle, as you can see in the photograph here. So the flow is locally much thicker right up against the obstacle than the flow thickness, sort of on an average, if the obstacle wasn't there, is. And so we can see a positive relationship between velocity and the height of this bow wave. And so if that bow wave then is going to create a much locally thicker flow, that's what we're interested in to determine when a flow is going to overtop an obstacle. And so we can investigate that further by looking at how things like the obstacle shape affect the height of that flow upslope of the obstacle. So here I plotted the time since the flow hit the obstacle against the flow height. And here I'm using obstacles that are V-shaped, upward pointed Vs. The side length is the same, but we vary the internal angle. So the blue experiment is with a 30-degree obstacle, so it's sort of aerodynamic, if you will, in the flow direction, whereas the 120-degree obstacle is much broader. And what we see is that the height behind the 120-degree obstacle is a lot greater than the height behind the 30-degree obstacle. So obstacle shape's very important. But we also see that the flow height upslope of the obstacle plateaus and reaches a steady state. So we hope to be able to describe what controls that height, the height of the flow, as a balance of forces. We can also look at oblique barriers and changing the orientation of an oblique barrier, so that as it goes out to 90 degrees and becomes orthogonal to the flow direction, the flow height increases, and we see that that relationship's approximately linear. And you can see how those experiments work in the far right. The flow is going down the slide, and we're rotating just a big wall at different angles to the flow direction. And then we can also change the size of the obstacle. So if we just look at a horizontal wall, the flow just hitting an orthogonal wall, if we vary the length of that wall, well, how does that change the height of the flow? And what we see is the longer the obstacle, the thicker the flow, but it's in a nonlinear way. So we can identify sort of all these different parameters about the obstacle that influence what the response will be by the flow and whether it will be able to overtop. So then we can add cooling. So we go to the Syracuse University Lava Project in upstate New York, and there they have a very large furnace. It can hold 450 kilograms of basalt. They get their basalt from Wisconsin. It's a gravel aggregate that they melt and then continue to remelt. And the whole furnace can tip. So it can pour lava into this chute and then onto a plane that we can set at a given angle. We can put now steel obstacles in the way and see how they respond. And we can monitor the experiments with overhead, visible, and infrared cameras. We mostly mounted these on top of a forklift that we could aim over the experiment. And then also an array of 10 cameras we mounted around the setup that were all triggered simultaneously during experiments over time. So a photo of some of these cameras is down there, just sort of cheap Canon point-and-shoots, which is good because I melted 4 of them. So this is an example of one of these experiments. And you can see that the flow is going to come out of the chute, so it's not quite the same as a point source flow, but it's still localized. And you can see it hitting a steel barrier. In this case, it's set at an 120-degree angle. We're also protecting a village of steel houses in this case, because the person who runs this lab is a sculpture professor and finds building things like that to be fun. Whoops, that was not right. So this is a video from my handheld camera, which I can't actually handle the brightness of the flow very well. But you can see that there's actually a thermocouple buried under the sand at that point. There's also an overhead infrared camera, so we get temperatures that way. And then as the flow hits the obstacle, as soon as it becomes a little less bright, you can see that it actually quenches against the obstacle. That it'll eventually form basically pohoi ropes as it progresses, and that these ropes sort of pile up against the back of the obstacle. We save the village. The village does not get damaged in this case. And you can also see there are 4 tiles, ceramic tiles, set out on the surface with funny symbols. These are ground control points for that camera array that was mounted around the setup. So we can locate all of those points in each camera view and use a technique called structure for motion to capture a 3D morphology of the flow at very high resolution, like millimeter resolution, at each time the camera takes pictures, which is about every 4 seconds or something like that. So yeah, now you can see the ropes pretty well and the pileup of material against the obstacle. So just to demonstrate the way we're getting at the 3D morphology and therefore how we're going to measure the thicknesses of the flow with time, because a giant caliper mounted over this experimental setup would be a little absurd. So this is the view from each of those 10 cameras during the same experiment. And we can use that to find matching points in each camera that we can locate in 3D space. So this is the view in 3 dimensions of a point cloud of the surface of the flow. So then we can query this point cloud to measure things like the flow height upslope of the obstacle with time. So we see a similar pattern to before. This is, again, a comparison between an 120-degree obstacle and a 180, which is the flat wall scenario. And that as you increase the internal angle of the obstacle, the flow thickness increases. But you can also see that the height does become steady. So again, it's similar to the syrup experiments in that way. But unlike the syrup experiments, where we only have thickness at the one point where we have a caliper measurement, we actually get the full 3D morphology with time in these experiments. So we could use this data to look at the formation of things like pohoi ropes or other sorts of things as well. So these experiments add the influence of cooling. And in this thermal image, you can see that the flow is quenched against this obstacle. You can see the ropes. And you can see in the photographs that a lot of the buildup upslope of the obstacle is the pileup of basically the deformation of the surface crust. That these ropes are piling up, and that's creating a lot of this similar bow wave feature that we see in the syrup experiments. But perhaps the mechanism is both viscous and the formation of the crust and the deformation of the crust. So it's gotten a little more complicated. We can also look at the effect of branching on flow advance, or the effect of hitting an obstacle on flow advance. So we see that with time, the flow initially advances and reaches a constant velocity before it hits the obstacle. The obstacle is placed far enough away that the flow is essentially channelized in advance of hitting the obstacle, so they reach a constant velocity and width. Once they hit the obstacle, they branch and then eventually form 2 parallel flows with constant width. They form levees and then reach a constant velocity that's significantly less than the initial velocity. And we can see that in a sort of single snapshot as well with surface velocities. So this, the plot on the far right is made basically by a pixel tracking technique to measure the instantaneous velocities inside the channel before and after splitting. And we see that before the flow splits, it's going at least twice as fast as after the flow splits. So we can combine the syrup and molten basalt results to try and look at how all these different parameters play a role. So this is a plot of that obstacle internal angle, the opening V-shaped obstacle. And now I'm plotting against flow height ratio. So that's the ratio of the flow height upslope of the obstacle compared to the flow thickness measured at the same location, but in an experiment without an obstacle present. And what we see is that the molten basalt experiments have much bigger development upslope of the obstacle relative to the syrup experiments, which are the blue ones here. We can look also at the obstacle in orientation, so these oblique linear obstacles. and plot against the flow height ratio. And we see that linear relationship in the molten basalt, or in the syrup experiments, but we also see a similar trend in the molten basalt, though we have way fewer experiments. They're much more expensive and difficult to do. And then we can do the same sort of analysis we did for the Pu'uo flows, of plotting the advance rate before the flow hits the obstacle and the advance rate after the flow hits the obstacle. And so the Pu'uo flows are now plotted in these black squares. So they fall along that 1 to 2 line again. I've also now included some Pu'uo flows that became confined. So looking at places where a flow is initially flowing freely down a surface and then runs into the margin of another flow or into what appears to be a gully in the topographic maps. And so it's unable to branch as much. So as sort of a similar case, since none of them actually hit linear oblique barriers, we see that in these sort of situations, the flows at Pu'uo do accelerate when they end up against another flow, for instance. And we can compare that to the molten basalt experiments that are the red circles. So the closed circles are the ones that split. The open circles are the ones that are just redirected, like the one on the top left or right. And we can see the split flows, again, they slow down. They fall around that 1 to 2 line. And that the ones that are redirected mostly fall above the 1 to 1 line. So they speed up when they're against the obstacle. And in the molten basalt experiments, we could only do 3 of these experiments. But in the syrup, we can do a lot more and look at the effect of this orientation of the obstacle on how much the flow speeds up or slows down when it hits it. So now I'm plotting the advance rate ratio, which is the advance rate of the flow along the obstacle relative to the advance rate right before the flow hit the obstacle. And so with increasing obstacle orientation, so starting from no obstacle and then adding a very, very oblique all the way to orthogonal obstacle, the flow initially advances a lot faster along the oblique obstacles, but eventually that obstacle becomes so much of a barrier that the flow along the obstacle is a lot slower. So we can see that you can really accelerate a flow quite a lot just by having it flow along, become confined along a barrier. And we can explain the advance rate behavior and the relationship, the flow height upslope of the obstacle, basically as a balance between the flow into the obstacle and how easily the flow is able to get past the obstacle. So what we see is that if you have a very orthogonal barrier, in fact, if you have a completely orthogonal barrier, the flow along the obstacle has no slope to go down. It has to move completely across the slope, so the effective slope is 0. And the only way that the flow is able to move sideways in that situation is through gravitational collapse of the flow itself. So it piles up behind the obstacle, and then it can only move laterally as it collapses. So it has to form quite a thick pile of fluid. And this is driven by the height gradient, essentially. Whereas as soon as you have an effective slope along the obstacle, you're at such an angle that the flow is able to go a little bit more downhill, even as it's confined by the margin of the obstacle. The flow is able to move a lot faster. And it's, in fact, able to move faster than initially as it approached the obstacle because it's confined on one side by the barrier and on the other side by gravity. So it essentially becomes channelized and a little thicker. And so it's able to move faster. And so we're still working out the exact theory of this with a group of mathematicians at the University of Bristol. And so they're starting to develop equations for this and apply those in numerical simulations around the simple cases of just a cylinder. It's very symmetric. The mathematicians love cylinders. They don't have edges like points and things. And so this is just a plot of flow thickness in one of their simulations around cylinder half space. And you can see the same sort of horseshoe-shaped bow wave of the pileup of fluid upslope of the cylinder. We can also do numerical simulations of these experiments. The videos are a little hard to see, with other numerical fluid dynamics models. So in this case, I'm using the bulk flow model, which is a very simple model developed by folks at Clermont-Ferrand. And doing essentially the same experiments I did with syrup, but numerically. And so we can compare the orientation of the barrier in the syrup experiments and the numerical experiments with that same height ratio. We can measure the thicknesses. And what we see is that the syrup experiments are the open symbols, the bulk flow runs are in the solid symbols, and that they line up pretty well, but the differences may be due to the lack of this entirely dynamic interaction that we see. And so in order to make better models for the way lava flows around such things, we can try to bring these closer together. So the conclusions for the experiments, then, are that they build on and support the observations from the Hawaiian flows. So that we see that optical interaction is governed by bow wave formation, maybe more so. The flows that are thicker than the obstacle can still go over the obstacle. But what determines whether the flow is actually thicker than the obstacle is a very local effect of this bow wave formation. We see that branched flows advance a lot more slowly. And we see that confinement can slow flows if it's very orthogonal, or actually accelerate them, depending on its orientation. And then overall, combining these two projects, we can see that pre-eruptive topography controls the geometry of lava flow channel networks, and that distributary networks are made up of flows branching around obstacles they can't overtop, and tributary networks can be made up of flows that are confined and merged by topography that they cannot overtop. So like the Mauna Loa 1984 flow compared to the Kilauea December 1974 flow. And we can see that the geometry of the channel networks impacts the flow morphology and behavior. So the flows slow and shorten when they split. That the actual connectivity within the channel, how long a given channel segment is active, affects the flow morphology. And that channel networks control the volume distribution. And that volume distribution is the same as the flux distribution, averaged over time. And that these have implications for hazard assessment. So they impact flow prediction, both in forming a hazard map as well as in a deterministic way for once an eruption begins. By identifying the actual scale of topography that a flow is going to respond to, the scale of topography that a flow will split or be confined by, and being able to quantify the effects of that confinement or that branching on the advance rate and behavior. And then certainly by sending flows into barriers or making them branch, we're mimicking diversion attempts. So we can, this data can help inform those. In the branching interventions they've done at Etna, blowing out sides of levees, being able to actually better predict what effect that's going to have. And then, oops, and PowerPoint crashed. But also, the effects of barriers, how to design a barrier. It didn't actually close. Well, how to design a barrier that the flow won't overtop, but will also have the appropriate effect. Like this barrier on the Mauna Loa 1984, or the upslope of the Mauna Loa Observatory. Something weird happened. But yes, so they have a V-shaped barrier upslope of the Mauna Loa Observatory that Jack Lockwood built back in the 80s. And so it's actually at an excellent geometry to function very well in that it will branch a flow and make it go less far downslope, but also at a small enough angle that it won't be overtopped as easily because it's a low angle obstacle. So then, I guess looking forward to what I'm doing here at the USGS, I'm a postdoc on the Saudi project here in the Volcano Science Center. And what I want to do here is apply sort of models and morphologic analysis that I've done for my PhD to lava flow hazard assessment for the hot volcanic field in Saudi Arabia or elsewhere if people have volcanoes they want hazard assessments for. And you can see where it is on this map. I'm giving you a preview. I think Drew's going to talk a whole lot more about this next week at this seminar. But the Rahat volcanic field is located in the western edge of Saudi Arabia and right next to the city of Medina. And you can see, maybe you can't see, all of the cones that dot the volcanic field, and also all of these recent lava flows, including a historic lava flow that they're now building a lot of houses on. And so we're interested in trying to assess the volcanic hazards from lava inundation and then also tephra in a small way. So I'm interested in applying the sort of models that I've been using to look at flow interaction with topography. This is just an example of a console model we've been running at the University of Oregon for this purpose, and then apply them probabilistically to assess the likelihood of inundation at any given place within the area. So this is, on the right, it's just a simulation of steepest descent paths and perturbing the topography a lot. So simulating a slightly modified topography and a new steepest descent path to see what areas are more likely to be inundated. This is the thing that people have done in a lot of volcanoes now around the world, and just identify the likelihood. So that's what I plan to do here, and I'll take any questions.
Please wait for this to come live. There. Questions for Hanna?
Thanks for your presentation. It really stimulates a lot of thought about where to go next. Your last graphic suggests a question that I had. This, you haven't explained it, but my understanding is that you use actual DEMs and kind of raindrop falling models to predict flow paths. And it seemed to me that you could do that with actual real lava or numerical lava to get refined results. And you could also do it in the laboratory with using 3D printing to generate the real topography and then put syrup or lava. Have people done that? Have you thought about that?
There was a master's student at, I think, University of Plymouth that 3D printed Etna and dumped syrup on top of it. But the scale of the lava flow in that situation is horrifyingly bad because it's about, I don't know, 15 stories thick or something like that at that scale. So you could do more reasonable topography in an analog setting. But that's really where you want to have a model that contains all of the physics that you see in the analog setting and then be able to put it over something a lot more real and scale it up, essentially. So that's sort of the value of doing an analog experiment to understand the real basics and then expand that in a numerical way.
Thank you.
But it would be fun.
Thank you, Hanna. What was the resolution, both horizontally and vertically, of the recalculated DEM for Mauna Loa from the pre-eruptive? And how did that affect the calculation of the thickness and volumes of the lava flows and the recognizing significant obstacles?
So the underlying DEM that we made for the full flow field was 10-meter resolution. And so because the flow is pretty thick, that's probably not good enough, but it's OK. I think the resolution you really want to model something on top of is more like 1 meter. It doesn't have to be probably vastly better than that because the flows have so much volume. You know, the width of the flow and the height of the flow is already so much greater than the pixel size that you're OK, and especially for more viscous flows. Yeah, so that 10 centimeter, we did do a higher resolution segment of it and compared that volume, and that compared pretty well to our final one. So we assessed the errors based on the sort of coarseness of the resolution of the underlying surface. And they're mostly fine, except that the underlying, that the flow went through a bunch of forest in places. And so we had to interpolate the surface underneath the trees to get at real volumes. And so that's probably a much bigger source of error.
So I have a question. All of your simulations in the lab and observations in the field were focused on branching created by encountering obstacles, which means that bifurcations should always get younger downslope. What proportion of observed branching is actually caused by breakouts so that things would get younger in a more chaotic fashion?
Yes. So on that longest, so I focused my analysis on those very short-lived sections of the Mauna Loa 1984 flow, and the the Kilauea December 1974 flow was only active for, I think, 8 hours, something like that. So there wasn't actually time to have any breakouts in those segments. So I was sort of isolating the problem in that way. In the longest-lived section of the flow, that fed the branches that went down closer to Hilo, I would say probably at least a third of the big branches are secondary. But then so there would be one breakout that would cause a big junction on the main channel. But then again, you'd form a number of simultaneous flows. But you could the people who were there would have the best idea. It's hard to tell sometimes from the morphology.
So what's the thinking as to what causes a breakout?
So things that get stuck in the channel, like a piece of levee that falls in, can cause an avulsion like the way a river would. You can have weak levees erode out. You can fill them with explosives and blow them up. In a lot of ways, it's a very stochastic sort of process. I mean, during the Mauna Loa 1984 flow, they tracked the big breakouts moving upslope, up toward the vent through time. So related basically to the rheology as the flow got further down, it definitely...
So it backed up?
Yeah, it would back up. Something would jam it because you're having a lot more crystallization and things like that. So yeah, there are trends. And certainly, there are places like if the flow is branched, folks have noticed that, or bent, folks have noticed that the inside levee wall may be likely to cave in, that lava flows actually straighten with time. So there are some aspects of it that could maybe be predicted, but it's hard, and I don't know what people... There's a Simone Tarquini at INGB has been working a little on this at Etna flows. But otherwise, I'm not sure what all has been done about it. But yes, it's a more stochastic process.
Any more questions from the... Yes, Shovel.
Very nice. Can you, with this knowledge, can you now upscale it to, let's say, rhyolitic flows? Or what would it take?
So I think that would take doing similar experiments with a different rheology. So we did our analog experiments with Newtonian syrup fluid. I'm helping supervise a master's student right now at the University of Bristol who's going to try adding crystals to that and making it a yield strength fluid and seeing what effect that has. Because if you change, you can generally, holistically increase the viscosity or something like that. But the reality is that it's behaving differently because it has a yield strength. And so that's not incorporated into this. And so you'd probably want to do a little bit more of the basic analog experiments in physics to figure out what effect that has before you just say, and if I increase the viscosity to 10 to the 4.
So it's not yet numerically that you can do it. You need to have more.
Yeah. at least a way to make sure that if you do that in your numerical model and just say that I'm giving it a yield strength now, it actually will behave the way it should in the real world.
Thanks.
Pete.
I'll make one quick comment. Tom and you were talking about the role of instabilities, and I sort of thought maybe in some of your diagrams, I think they were thickness of the flow versus discharge. When you did it with the syrup, it absolutely plateaued out. But when you did it with the molten lava, there were really some undulations in it, and I wondered if maybe you actually were beginning to model in a very small way some of the kinds of instabilities that, yes, during the Mauna Loa eruption, there were incredible variations in the flow rates in channels because of barriers and damming and breakouts. So the downflow velocities were highly variable in all kinds of duration timeframes.
Yeah, so the sort of variations in that thickness upslope of the obstacle, I think, is definitely related to that, in that it's related to the surface crust deformation. And so that as you pile on a rope that's taller, it's a little more discretized in that way.
Varying the effect of viscosity.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's it for questions. We're, of course, going off to Teddy's to have lunch, or I guess it's not Teddy's now.
The
It's
Tectonic Cafe.
Tectonic Cafe. Please join us.
Or the grill.
And thank you again.